One of the biggest changes that came with industrialization on the scale that happened in the Gilded Age was a change in urban landscapes. City life isn't new to the United States by any means. Urban centers existed in indigenous societies long before white colonizers even arrived on the shores of the Americas. But new forms of technology, the invention of steel beams, electrical power, and public transportation networks, created an urban landscape unlike that which existed in the pre-Civil War era. So, in the sense that we consider a frontier a place of relative unknown, the urban landscapes of the 19th and early 20th century can be seen as a sort of new frontier. They were places where innovators and innovation usually got their start. They were spaces of diversity, which brought with it both oppression and progress. And they were most definitely places that were expanding rapidly enough that they sometimes outpaced formal legal and political structures. This meant that sometimes political and criminal corruption crept into communities and became part of the fabric of political, social, and economic life. Political machines like Tammany Hall would fit into this category, using criminal enterprises to meet the needs of the growing community, all the while filling their own political and economic needs. There are a lot of reasons for this growth. If you look at this chart of population centers from the start of the 19th and 20th centuries, we can get a sense of why some of these areas have higher populations than others during these periods. In 1800, the cities with the highest five populations are in China, the UK, Turkey, and France. Now, obviously, these areas all have in common in that time period the benefit of being at the center of areas that were central to trade routes, and at least some are starting in on early industrialization at this point. But one of the things that we don't necessarily think of, which has a huge impact on population, is that culturally, all of these populations are also tea drinkers. Actually, all of the populations on this side of the list are. And this has a huge impact on their population because the first step to making a pot of tea is that you have to boil the water. And by boiling water, you're disinfecting it essentially. So, unlike tons of other people across the planet, the people in these cities and countries on this side of the list are pretty regularly drinking a clean source of water. This has a huge impact on their day-to-day health and ability to maintain a growing population at the turn of the 19th century. In the 1900s, the cities with the top five highest populations are in the UK, US, France, and Germany. At this point, population density has less to do with survivability and more to do with immigration, more to do with industrialization. These are the world's industrial centers. So within essentially 1 century, we go from surviving to thriving as the hallmark of population draw. It's also worth noting the pace at which some of these cities are growing. Paris was on both lists at nearly 500,000 in 1800 and then about 3.3 million a century later. This is pretty fast growth. But notice that New York, for example, isn't even on the list in 1800, so they have less than 300,000 people in 1800. And then by a century later, they've outpaced even Paris with nearly 4.25 million people. So when we talk about the city's growth outpacing the political and legal infrastructure, this is the kind of thing we're talking about. Even if things like fire departments, building inspectors, and public schools existed back then, which for the most part they didn't, they wouldn't be able to grow fast enough to keep up with this growth. So where are all of these people coming from? Some of it is obviously natural population growth, but the biggest amount of it is immigration. In the pre-Civil War era, the Market Revolution, we saw old immigration from places like Germany and Ireland. These people tended to settle in the Northeast to work in factories like Lowell and settle in the Midwest to become farmers, like in the German Belt. In the Gilded Age, we have what's called new immigration, populations coming from primarily Southern and Eastern Europe. That's not to say that people aren't still coming from Ireland, Germany, and England. There's still plenty of that, as you can see in the green on our chart here. But more to say that along with those people, we have new immigrants here in the pink and blue, coming from places like Poland, Russia, and Italy. Keep in mind that until the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, there are also immigrants coming from China, and even very limited numbers after that because there are still very small exceptions made to the law. And then after that, other immigrants from Asia coming from places like Japan. Beginning in the 1890s, these immigrants from Europe passed through processing centers like at Ellis Island. Ellis Island opened in 1892 to receive immigrants from Europe. On the Pacific coast, a similar station, Angel Island, opened around 1910 to process immigrants coming from those ports. In essence, the way that this worked is that when migrants boarded the ships for the United States, they would have to give an account of who they were to the ship's captain for him to put onto the ship's manifest. You can see an example of what this looks like here on the bottom left. This includes the head of the household if you are traveling in a group, and the rest of the members of their party, where they're coming from, and could include things like how much money they have, if they currently have family in the US already, if they already have a job secured or home in the US, how much English they speak, if you have a criminal record, etc. Essentially, they want to know how much of a liability you're going to be. And it's the job of the ship's captain to turn away anyone bad, because if they get to the US and the customs officials turn away somebody, the captain then has to take that person back to Europe at their own expense. And so when they get to the United States, the customs officials get this document from the captain and they go aboard the ship and check out the health of all of the first and second class passengers. This is important to note because these people get to leave. They don't have to go through the customs process. If you're an immigrant with enough money to buy a first or second class ticket and you pass a basic physical, they just assume that you're fine and send you straight to New York, no questions asked. That's the benefit of wealth. But if you're a third class passenger, which most of the people are, then they take you to Ellis Island to go through the entire process. So once you get to Ellis Island, the ship's manifest is given over to the customs officials at the port, and they send you through the processing center that you see on the top right, or at least this is one of the buildings. And throughout this process, they're checking your story. They're asking you questions to double check that you didn't lie on the form that you gave them, to make sure that you are who you said that you are. If you said that you have money with you, they make you prove it. If you said that you have family in the US already, they make you show them maybe letters from that family member with their address on it to prove that. And keep in mind that at this time, they might not necessarily speak your language and are probably not super friendly. And you might have your 5 whiny kids with you who are in need of a snack. And part of this process is a physical, so they're checking to make sure that you don't have any physical signs of deformity or disease. One of the primary things that they do is check people's eyes. And the thing that they use for this is a hook tool, like you see here on the right, to pull back your eyelids and pull all the way around your eye to see down into your eyes. Because when you look at someone's eyes, they're mostly water. So if someone is sick, the eyes are going to be the first place that show because they'll turn discolored, usually red or yellow. Now, the super gross part of this, as if that's not already uncomfortable, is that germ theory isn't something we're super on board with in the early years of Ellis Island, so nobody is really cleaning these tools. So they use this in your eyes and then go right on to the next person and stick it in their eye without cleaning it, which means if like the guy before you had pink eye, you're going to get pink eye. So in some cases, these kinds of things led to more disease. And imagine how terrifying this would be, especially for a child, if someone is trying to do this and they can't explain to you what they're doing because you don't speak their language. At the end of this, if anyone didn't pass the physical or didn't pass the questioning examination part, they were usually sent back to wherever they came from. The rest were put on ferries and sent along to New York City. Simply making it through Ellis Island or Angel Island on the Pacific coast didn't mean things were immediately better. We know that as long as there have been immigrants in the United States, there has been nativism or an extreme hatred of immigrants. The Gilded Age was no different. Gilded Age nativism really wasn't too different from nativism that we see in the US today. People in the Gilded Age saw immigrants as stealing jobs from, quote, real Americans. Who they perceived as real Americans varied by region and over time. Initially, immigrants from Ireland and Germany struggled to fit into the model of real Americanism because of language barriers and especially Irish Catholicism. This prevented them from being seen as truly white Americans and left them excluded from political and economic mobility. But as new immigrants with even more foreign languages and customs, with new religious traditions and clothing and food and other customs came to the United States, our old immigrants gradually became more acceptable as real or white Americans. In the face of radical newness, the old novelty wore off, and white Americans of the old colonial American tradition welcomed them, even begrudgingly, as allies against a new foreign foe. This was especially the case when it comes to jobs. This group that perceived themselves as real or white Americans saw themselves as the rightful heirs to jobs in the Americas. After all, their families had been here the longest, been working the longest, and in the case of old immigrants from Germany and Ireland, worked the hardest to do things like learn English in order to become successful in these jobs. In their minds, how dare these new immigrants come in and steal these jobs with their willingness to work longer hours for less wages? On the flip side, new immigrants coming into the United States had to take literally whatever jobs they could find in order to avoid homelessness. On top of that, the low wages and long hours were still often better than the lifestyle that they were facing back home wherever they came from. Second, nativists saw immigrants as too attached to their languages and customs. Today, we hear all the time or see on bumper stickers and t-shirts, "You're in America, speak English." Never mind the fact that America isn't the United States, and America is actually a grouping of two continents that includes the fluency of several languages, including English, French, Portuguese, Spanish, and surviving indigenous dialects. In the Gilded Age, though, unwillingness to learn English was seen as an inhibiting factor to success. This was especially the case among those who were from the old immigrant group who had learned English and now were part of an upper level of the laboring classes. They looked on new immigrants who didn't know English as lesser than, with the assumption that if I can do it, you can do it. These kinds of classist assumptions aren't new or novel only to immigrant groups. We see similar trends within, for example, the African American community. In the post-Reconstruction era, and other eras as well, African Americans from well-to-do families sometimes looked down on those within their community from lesser means, with the mentality almost like, well, why aren't you where I am? They failed to recognize the head start that they got from their starting position in life. And never having been in the position of their less wealthy counterparts, in their circumstances, it made it incredibly difficult to empathize with the reasons behind their decisions to do certain things. The same trend also happens time and time again in the fight for women's equality. Women from dramatically different racial and class backgrounds often look at each other like they're totally crazy when they vote differently from each other, have different consumer habits from each other, or aspire to different educational goals from each other. We have to remember that no group, whether it's a racial group, economic group, immigrant group, or social group, is a monolith. No group thinks alike or acts exactly alike or knows what all of the members of that group are experiencing. And that's why sometimes we see conflict like this within groups and sometimes see groups acting against each other, even on things where it seems like they should agree, like reform or civil rights. This doesn't mean that something is broken or wrong. It just means that people are complex. And so when it comes to our old and new immigrant groups, the old immigrants who are now absorbed into the group of what we would consider real Americans identify more with white Americans than with our new immigrants, even though they do understand what these people are going through, or at least their parents would have. Most of these people are probably born in the US. The last major accusation against our new immigrants is that they were mentally and physically inferior to white Americans. This isn't something that's new to us today either, but was relatively new at the time to a certain degree. Prior to the Gilded Age, one might discuss the inferiority of an immigrant group or person by discussing their general characteristics or morality or looks. But near the turn of the 20th century, Darwin's theory of evolution kicked off a field day of what we usually refer to as scientific racism. This is essentially all of the ways that scientists and medical practitioners used to try to justify racist policies and practices. So, for example, phrenology is the study of skull shape and size and the bumps on people's heads. Scientists use this fake science to line up skulls by race from white Europeans down to African gorillas and prove, quote, quote, that due to the size and shape of their heads, white people were superior. This is clearly bogus, but was used for years as scientific evidence. During World War I, the U.S. Army used supposed intelligence testing to analyze recruits. The report based on this testing concluded that the mixing of races was responsible for declining education and intelligence in the United States and called for, quote, public action to be aroused to prevent it. The same test was then rebranded as the Scholastic Aptitude Test, or SAT, and is now administered to thousands of high school students every year as a benchmark for college admission. In reality, the immigrants coming from Southern and Eastern Europe on average weren't any less intelligent than the people already in the United States, just like immigrants today. Was it sometimes difficult for them to show their intellectual strengths when they didn't necessarily speak the same language as the people in positions of power? Certainly. That's a problem in all places at all times. This is also one of the reasons that oftentimes we see that immigrants who are praised for the intellectual accomplishments that they have are those that are making gains in areas like science and mathematics, because those aren't necessarily areas where you need to be able to communicate in English or any other specific language in order to get your ideas across. Tesla, for example, wouldn't need to speak great English in order to work out scientific formulas. Math is the same in essentially every language. Music can be this way as well. And so in that way, some areas of genius are privileged over others. So we have to recognize that there are potentially a lot of visionary poets, authors, lawyers, or teachers that were never given a chance in our nation's history because we weren't speaking their language. Nativism also fueled official policy, though, like the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was part of U.S. immigration law from 1882 until World War II. The same factors that applied to immigrants coming from Southern and Eastern Europe also led to a hatred of Chinese immigrants. But unlike immigrants from Europe, who white Americans felt some kind of connection to, they often viewed Chinese immigrants and later Japanese immigrants as an alien other. Mainstream Americans looked at the cultures and customs of Chinese immigrants as so foreign and so different from their own that they couldn't possibly bridge the gap. And unlike immigrants from Europe, they often weren't really willing to try. And so nativist portrayals of Chinese immigrants often showed them not as just outsiders, but often inhuman monsters like we see here on the left. Our immigrant man is seen as an octopus-like monster waiting to ensnare Americans with diseases like smallpox, drugs like opium, gambling addictions, and other vices. In our cartoon on the right that criticizes this policy, our Chinese immigrant is ready outside the gates of liberty with things like industry, meaning hard work, and order, but still isn't allowed in because he happens to come from China. These are all things we're familiar with today. The idea that immigrants or refugees coming from Latin America or countries in Africa or the Middle East bring disease and drugs with them, or other things that are in need of regulation or government oversight. Things politicians assure the public it will take loads of taxpayer dollars to deal with. Or the idea that American job market can't possibly absorb immigrant workers, or that they'll drive the price of labor down to unreasonable prices. These aren't new arguments. In fact, they're some of the oldest arguments our country sees on repeat, and almost always against immigrant and minority groups. Immigrant communities who did make it to the U.S. tended to settle in distinctive ethnic communities within urban centers in the United States, areas that were referred to as ghettos. Today, the term ghetto has a distinctively negative connotation that comes from World War II, when German Nazis used ghettos to seclude Jewish communities before and during the Holocaust. This then continued after World War II in the U.S. as urban ghettos became synonymous with politicians' attempts to paint urban black communities living in these areas as drug-infested and crime-ridden. But during the Gilded Age, these were really just the areas that our various ethnic and cultural groups lived in. That's not to say that there was nothing wrong with this. Many times ethnic communities lived in specific sections of the city because they had to, either because it was unsafe for them to live in other parts of the city due to racial or religious hatred, or because it was too expensive to live in other parts of the city. So in this sense, ghettos of the Gilded Age were very much an effect of segregation and its negative consequences. But at the same time, these communities allowed cultures from around the world to continue to flourish within the urban population centers of the U.S. Cities like Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York each had their own little Poland, Little Italy, or Chinatown. And within these neighborhoods, people found commonality with those who spoke their language, went to the same church, ate the same food, and celebrated the same holidays. Even perhaps without family, immigrants weren't necessarily alone. This level of community meant that immigrants and other ethnic groups often helped each other in ways that white society and government or economic institutions wouldn't. But it also meant that those same communities were at the mercy of unregulated, once regulations existed, systems, sometimes criminal enterprises, and often uncertain support. Remaining within tight-knit communities, whether by choice or by force, also meant that these minority groups lacked the kind of exposure to mainstream white culture that usually led to assimilation and economic mobility. In order to accommodate this growing population, cities constructed buildings out of steel, which 99% of the time was Carnegie steel. In the past, buildings made from wood frames and brick coverings could really only be built a few stories tall. After that, the weight of the building would be too much to support itself. This is why cities would inevitably have to max out at a certain population limit. They'd inevitably have to move outward, which would eventually just create new cities as they move further and further out. But with the invention of the Bessemer process, which made the production of steel more efficient and therefore less expensive, steel beam construction was a lot easier. This meant that virtually any building could be constructed pretty much as tall as someone wanted. So the Gilded Age became the dawn of what today is called the skyscraper. In Midwest cities like Chicago, the Chicago School of Architecture came to symbolize this movement for its more modern and simplistic design of buildings that emphasized function over fashion, although they tended to have a ton of windows. In this style, steel beam buildings pretty much looked like what they were. We can see this with the Marshall Fields department store here on the left and the Fisher building on the right, which was an apartment building. When it comes to residential living, most people in the city lived in what are called tenements. These were pretty small living spaces that didn't necessarily have fixed renting schedules, so in theory you could rent for a week at a time rather than a whole month or longer. If you look at the graphic on the screen, these rented spaces have different looks depending on your needs. Like apartments today, they might have one bedroom or multiple. They also tended to have a very small kitchen, although that term could mean a lot of things depending on where you live, and might include something like a parlor or living room type space or not. Depending on how up to date the tenement was, there might be a toilet or bathroom space or not. That might just be a bedpan in the bedroom that got emptied out on the fire escape or an open window in the morning. So the quality of what your tenement looked like varied pretty dramatically based on what kind of money you had and how many people you were trying to provide for. But typically speaking, they took essentially the shape of a dumbbell like we see here in this diagram, which is why we often hear them referred to as dumbbell tenements. In theory, there's a long hallway that goes down the middle and then about 4 apartments or tenements on each floor. On the bottom floor, there might be a green space or garden in the middle. So to give an example of what one of these rooms looks like, this is an example of 5-cent lodgings. Let's assume that this means 5 cents per week, although to be totally honest, I'm not 100% sure. So when we're talking about these tenements having bedrooms, this is what that means. We're not talking about like your bedroom at home with a bed and a dresser and a PlayStation and a chair in the corner that you put all of your clean laundry on that you still haven't folded from last week. This room has all of these people's earthly belongings in it. Speaking of people, there are 7 people staying in this one room. Maybe they know each other, maybe they don't. And in the corner here on the left, there's a furnace with stuff piled on it, which is a huge fire hazard. If that catches on fire, these guys are all essentially dead. Here we see a comparison of men's and women's lodgings because there's no mixing here unless you're married. So not to judge or anything, but the men's lodgings is a bit of a mess compared to the women. These rooms are clearly a bit larger than the last one we saw. These are potentially the parlor rooms we saw in the diagram, but being used to house people instead, because if they can pay rent, you should totally charge them to sleep there. So in the men's lodgings, we've got 8 people, by my count, staying in this one room. In this room, at least the furnace doesn't have things piled on it, but there is that giant pile of wood right next to it that's a fire hazard. Never mind the fact that things like rats, snakes, spiders, and other vermin like to live in piles of wood like that. In the women's lodgings, we have 5 or 6 women in a tidier space. They're even doing laundry. But one has to wonder where they're going to get the fuel for that furnace. And those buckets on the floor, presumably they're using those for laundry, but also probably as a toilet. Yikes. Which brings us to the ever-present problem of disease. Illnesses like tuberculosis, typhoid, cholera, syphilis, and smallpox have been issues in urban areas since the dawn of urban areas and people. And over time, medical practitioners from indigenous healers to Western doctors to midwives have found ways of preventing, curing, or at least softening the effects of these diseases. In the 1850s, though, Dr. John Snow of Great Britain discovered what we know of today as germ theory. In 1854 in Soho, London, they experienced a massive cholera outbreak that killed tons of people. Medical minds at the time attributed the disease to miasma, or bad air. The idea was that the air in London, or the famous London fog, carried all sorts of diseases from Black Death to STDs. But Dr. Snow wasn't convinced of this. He made an impact map by going around and knocking on the doors of homes and businesses and asking people how many members of their household died of cholera, and then made a mark on the map for each person, as you can see here. What he noticed in Soho in particular was that the number of people who died seemed to be heavily concentrated around the water pump. But then he noticed that at the brewery, like beer brewery, literally nobody died. So he went to ask them again, and they verified that this was correct. He asked them if they used the water from the pump down the road, and they said that they did, but they didn't really drink the water. They just used it to make their beer, which is what they usually drink. So Dr. Snow asked them to show him their process for making beer and surmised that in the fermentation process, there must be something that somehow cleaned the water. He went to the boards of health with this theory that it was the water, not the air, killing people, and he was largely ignored. After all, they couldn't see anything wrong with the water, and not everyone died after drinking it. It wasn't for several years and an additional study of miners and well water that the boards of health finally conceded that Snow was right the entire time. By the late Gilded Age, though, this was pretty widely accepted enough that people understood that they needed to not just leave human waste around in their homes. It needed to go somewhere else. This led to more people installing water closets, that today we would call bathrooms, indoors. It also led entire cities to re-look at their sewage management. Chicago, for example, lifted entire city blocks several feet off the ground using railroad jacks in order to install plumbing underneath buildings. But just like we've seen with the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, there's a huge difference between what the government can do for itself and the time it takes for the government to regulate businesses in favor of the public's health. Many businesses didn't want to incur the costs of cleaning their stores or washing their hands before handling food or staying home if they were sick. All of those things would cause them to lose out on profit. It took years of radical public action in favor of public health codes for businesses, and usually in ads like this one framed as something to do with protecting the children, before state governments began passing even basic health codes for businesses. Things that we find super basic, like no shoes, no shirt, no service, actually come from a time when people who didn't wear shoes inside a business could literally be carrying in parasitic infections through their bare feet. Signs in bathrooms like employees must wash hands before returning to work are a reminder of a time when that was not a requirement. Part of the reason why businesses were so slow to adopt this change, or see it as their responsibility to adopt this change, was because of the ideas of social Darwinism. At its core, social Darwinism took Charles Darwin's basic idea of survival of the fittest and applied it to other aspects of society that it wasn't intended to go with. So they claimed that, for example, the wealthy deserved to be wealthy and the poor deserved to be poor because wealthy people got to where they were in life by some inherent superiority of their being. In this model, wealth was a sign of God's approval, not a sign of excess or frivolous living. So under this same idea, the concept that businesses would do something that would eliminate their ability to gain wealth in order to put the poor on a better footing goes against this idea. So in the example of health practices, they would ask why the business would be the ones to have to pay to regulate their health practices. Why should I have to make sure that my store doesn't have bugs in it? Why can't the people who buy the food just wash it when they get home? If they're smart enough, they'll do that anyway. That's the general logic. But even more than that, this applies to the workings of businesses with each other, not so much the relationship between producer and consumer, business and buyer. So, as we see with John D. Rockefeller here, saying this to his Sunday school class, presumably as a justification for something thought he did wrong, he says, quote, "Growth of a large business is merely a survival of the fittest." So, Darwinism there. "The American beauty rose can be produced in the splendor and fragrance which brings cheer to its beholder only by sacrificing the early buds which grow up around it. This is not an evil tendency in business. It's merely the working out of a law of nature and of God." End quote. So here, Rockefeller is comparing businesses to flowers in a garden, saying if you look at a garden, a rose bush only flourishes by choking out everything around it. And really, rose bushes don't care if the things around it are weeds or other flowers, for those of you not familiar with gardening. Because in order for a rose bush to grow up and make beautiful roses that we all love to look at and smell, it needs a ton of nutrients. So it kills off virtually everything else within a certain radius. And he's saying nobody looks at a beautiful rose bush and is like, "Ah, murderer." Because that's how God made it to act. It's literally doing what it was purposed to do. And he's saying that in our free market economy that he presumes God intended for the United States to have, that's also how business is supposed to act. It's not evil for business to choke out the weaker or smaller businesses around it. That's just how business is. He's arguing that people should look at his business and other monopolies like him as if they're a rose bush. It's sad that maybe other people's businesses got trampled by them, perhaps, but it's not their fault that those businesses weren't rose bushes, that it wasn't their purpose, their destiny to become the better flower or business. And so using that logic, it's a pretty solid metaphor actually, Rockefeller isn't wrong. In a straight up free market economy, that's totally how this works. The problem is that our economy isn't completely unregulated, nor has it ever been that way. There have always been incentives for certain companies over others, and things like tariffs to promote growth. Think of it like Miracle-Gro for certain companies over others. Or to take the analogy in another direction, Rockefeller's idea is what this looks like in nature, but what about in a garden that has a gardener? The most beautiful gardens in the world are carefully tended by professional gardeners who know exactly what they need. In this analogy, the gardener would be the government or whoever else is doing the regulating. It could be labor unions in theory. This would prevent the rose bush, our monopolies, from eating up everything around them, but also give them the room to grow by making sure that they get nutrients. The problem is that under ideas of social Darwinism, there isn't room for this kind of compromise. Laboring classes are laborers because they can't cut it as bosses. So in the minds of our robber barons, there isn't a need to regulate things to make things easier for them or better for them, or make it more convenient for them to make it into middle management, or heaven forbid for them to have more political power. Because the entire premise is that these people are where they are and who they are because there's something inherently wrong with them. If there wasn't, they'd already be doing better. For his part, Carnegie also agreed with these ideas. In his Gospel of Wealth, he championed the ideas that inequality is an inevitable aspect of life and should be accepted as something that is ultimately good for society as, quote, essential for the future progress of the race. Under his understanding of Darwinism's impact on society, the competition between people of different races and classes and skill sets would drive people towards betterment. In the meantime, though, he suggested that the higher classes of society might act as trustees for the poorer classes, making political and economic decisions on their behalf. Or as Carnegie put it, quote, doing for them better than they would or could do for themselves. This same concept that we see here as social Darwinism in the context of Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth is something that we have seen before as paternalism in other time periods, especially applied to African Americans during enslavement and in the Reconstruction period, or to Native Americans. It's also the exact same logic applied to people in the Philippines and Cuba and Puerto Rico and other American and non-American colonies to prevent those people from exercising political agency. But in those circumstances, we call it the white man's burden. Like many other concepts in American history, this is not new. It's just repackaged for a new context and new people. One of the ways Carnegie attempted to act as a trustee for his poorer brethren was to build libraries and other acts of philanthropy. Often, the very wealthy use philanthropy or gifts of wealth to community causes in order to avoid doing other more meaningful things. This isn't new to us today. Billionaires today donate a few $1,000,000 to a local school to distract from the fact that they dodged a few $100 million in taxes, or that their company pumped toxic waste into the environment or had a massive data breach. In the Gilded Age, Carnegie and Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan were no different. They built railroad depots, libraries, music halls, and universities to avoid government regulation and prison time. More specifically, Carnegie built over 2,500 libraries between the US and Canada. But as this Harper's Weekly cover points out, this, quote, very solid temple of fame, or wall of libraries, is hiding his steel refinery pumping out smokestacks in the background. So the message here is that he's really only building these to distract people from what's happening in his business. Workers went on strike? Yikes, that's not good PR. Better open a few libraries to balance out the news cycle. Killed some workers in a plant meltdown? Oops, maybe open a music hall in New York. As one of his own workers said, quote, I would sooner enter a building built with the dirty silver Judas received for betraying Christ than enter a Carnegie library. Ouch. But part of the problem was that his workers often couldn't even go to his libraries. When would they have the time? Because despite the fact that he was building these structures, one, he didn't pay for them to have any books in them. The communities had to procure those themselves. And two, it's not like he was going to let his workers take a few hours off to go read. But we should also consider that industrial workers might not be the only ones who would be going to these libraries. They were, after all, open to everyone. Imagine the impact that a library would have on a girl whose parents couldn't afford a formal education or didn't feel the need to send her to school. A library, even one with only a modest book collection, could give her an education beyond anything she'd be able to accomplish otherwise. Or consider perhaps a worker who's injured on the job and now can't work any longer in a physical capacity, but also doesn't necessarily have the funds to pay for a formal education. A library could give him, a disabled person, the education necessary to access higher education to get a skilled position in an office, or attend college to still earn a living. So yes, Carnegie 100% believed that anyone could achieve the same dream that he did, come to the United States, work hard, and own your own business. He was also completely out of touch with the realities of how those libraries and other acts of philanthropy were perceived by his workers and people intimately aware of his actions and political motives. But that doesn't mean that we necessarily have to view the actions themselves as a complete waste for the people that they did benefit. This is part of the balance in viewing these men as both captains of industry and robber barons, balancing intent and action and consequence. Our robber barons certainly weren't the only ones receiving criticism during this period, internally or externally. At the turn of the century, churches were often seen as places of hypocrisy, where uppity white people went to talk bad about immigrants and minorities and poor people, even though that's essentially directly in contrast to what the Bible teaches. And for this reason, churches saw massive decreases in attendance. Why would people want to go where they're not welcome? Reverend Washington Gladden wanted to fix this. He wanted to bring Christianity back to the people he thought it rightfully belonged to, or at least evangelize it most to the people he thought it most spoke to, the poor, the hated, the downtrodden, the rejected. And he did this through a sweeping religious socialism movement called the Social Gospel Movement. The essence of his ideas were that the ideas of social Darwinism were a slap in the face to God and the gospel, and that the purpose of wealth was to honor others through meeting their actual needs. In his mind, issues tied to poverty and crime could be solved most efficiently by abandoning materialism and using wealth to meet the needs of the community. Someone who followed the general attitude of the social gospel movement when it comes to helping poor and immigrant communities was Jane Addams. Addams was part of a larger settlement house movement which started in England and then was brought over to the US by reform-minded women. I want to point out that Jane Addams herself wasn't really necessarily officially part of the social gospel movement, though. She was generally skeptical of churches and had tended to also have a hand in socialist labor organizing, although she didn't really identify herself as a socialist politically either, because she didn't agree with all of their political philosophies as an organized party. So really, when we look at Jane Addams, we should see her as a woman rather unattached from the movement she had a hand in, but with a hand in a lot of things in order to do what she thought was the most good for the people she wanted to serve. The idea behind settlement houses was to bring wealthy women and poor women together in urban environments so that they could benefit from interactions with each other and the respective knowledge that each other could bring. Adams' first settlement house in Chicago, Hull House, is the most famous in the United States, or at least one of them. The focus here was really to assimilate immigrant women and their children, especially their children, into mainstream, meaning white, American life. Hull House helped urban women with education, childcare, nutrition advice, and health services, and taught English lessons. Hull House also offered a place for labor organizers to meet. Addams and her counterpart in several aspects of reform, Florence Kelley, were key advocates for labor organizing and reform. They wanted to ensure that all workers, but especially women, had safe conditions, good pay, and reasonable hours. They also fought hard against child labor. Part of the mission of Hull House was to ensure that the children of these immigrants might assimilate quickly into white American culture, even if their parents didn't or struggled to. Addams hoped that by putting these children within proximity of wealthy, proper women like herself and teaching them English from the start, these children might Americanize and assimilate within a single generation, unlike the old immigrants who had often taken several generations to become what most considered normal or real Americans. Despite Jane Addams' dedication to children and their advancement, which, while well-intentioned, certainly also held paternalistic tones, Hull House was segregated until the 1930s. This left Black communities to create their own organizations, their own models for community engagement and education, and their own centers of child rearing and uplift. The reason for this was codified in law as much as it was a decision made by those in charge of social and community organizations. During Radical Reconstruction, state governments that finally represented the racial demographics of their state through the election of Black representatives passed laws requiring equality between white and Black communities. In 1875, the Civil Rights Act dictated that on a federal level, racial discrimination was prohibited in all public spaces. But after the end of military protection for Black voters and the end of Reconstruction in 1877, and the ushering in of Redeemer governments after that, all forms of progress came to a screeching halt and then went into steady reverse. In 1883, a series of Supreme Court cases referred to normally as the civil rights cases overturned the Civil Rights Act by ruling that Congress had no authority to legislate on the discrimination done by private individuals. In 1890, Louisville, New Orleans, and Texas Railway versus Mississippi ruled that states were allowed to pass laws requiring segregation on modes of public transportation. 6 years later, the landmark case Plessy versus Ferguson upheld segregation, saying that as long as states and businesses maintained a code of, quote, separate but equal accommodations, it was not a violation of civil rights and did not stigmatize any one group as inferior. This case was, in effect, the final word on segregation for nearly a century. Segregationist policies came to be known as Jim Crow laws after the infamous minstrel character who mocked and ridiculed African Americans. This map very clearly lays out how this system worked. The orange-shaded states are ex-Confederate states that practice segregation. The dates in red are dates at which they began legally segregating their railroad cars, which usually was one of the easiest and first things to be segregated. The date in black is the date at which the states passed the first law that prevented African Americans from voting. Some general trends to notice: Arkansas passed both things in the same year. Notice also that South Carolina, which if you recall was the first of the original 13 colonies to have a Black majority, is the only one of these states to pass the disenfranchisement law before the segregation law. Life in the city presented a whole host of new opportunities for those who lived there. At the same time that urban growth presented challenges for the people who lived there and the people who governed, cities also flourished with opportunity. Women, minorities, and immigrants benefited from a boom in jobs that didn't necessarily care who you were as long as you could work. Although, to be fair, some of these jobs were not great. But for some people, any job was a step up from a life of desolation, poverty, and dependence. And for these groups in particular, the city, even at its worst, also provided a space where they could connect to others like themselves and join communities of like-minded people geared towards bettering their condition. Ethnic and minority communities created enclaves of support like this that lasted for generations and often still exist today. And women's organizations across ethnic and class boundaries helped create momentum and interconnectedness that propelled movements like the women's suffrage movement. In conjunction with the populace, these reform-minded individuals helped propel the United States into a new era of progressive politics in the 20th century, the Progressive Era.